This is Martin L. Shoemaker, welcoming you to the Instant Story Hour, where story comes first. And my lovely and talented assistant tonight is Writers of the Future winner Kate Julicher, reading from her work. And take it away, Kate.
I am going to read an excerpt from a short story entitled To Lie with Honor. This was published at newmyths.com, issue 58, and is available to read for free in its entirety if you like what you have to hear here. A flash of crimson off in the barren woods caught my eye. I stopped in my tracks. The lonely mountain road was ill-traveled at the best of times, which this wasn't. Tiny flecks of snow swirled around my head, settling on my shoulders and soaking through my threadbare cloak. I hadn't seen anyone all day and didn't expect to meet anyone until I reached the next town. The only people out in this weather were bandits and tax collectors. I wasn't either, though I had fled the capital with a pouch not nearly full enough of other people's money. I waited, listening. The bitter wind whistled through the pines. Pale afternoon light filtered down, the snow flurries drifting along like motes of dust in the sunbeams. Nothing else moved. The crimson, whatever it was, lay well off the road. The next town lay miles down the cold wagon track. If I wanted to be indoors with a good meal and the prospect of acquiring other people's money in front of me, I needed to keep moving. No good would come of curiosity. I clambered up the bank, grabbing a pine tree trunk to pull myself up. The bark rasped my chapped hands. The ground, not as hard-packed as the road's wagon ruts, squelched under my boots. Mud oozed in through a hole that I thought I'd plugged this morning. I ignored it and crept as quietly as I could. The dry branches of bushes rustled as I passed. Nothing else stirred. The crimson was a cape someone had dropped 100 feet off the road and 5 feet from the first body. I pulled up short as soon as I saw the corpse. His head faced me, a good yard from the rest of his body. He looked rather surprised. His rough-cut clothes and scarred face suggested to me that he was a bandit who'd lived a bad life and met a worse end. The cloak was good heavy wool, well dyed with little variation in the vibrant hue. I picked it up and checked for blood, but it was clean. The clasp was still on it, a golden pin shaped like an arrow. I threw on the cloak and felt immediately warmer. A half-dozen more corpses littered the woods nearby. They'd died recently, judging by how the blood still pooled on the ground. Thanks to the cold, there was little stench and no flies. The corpses were all armed with short swords or cudgels. They'd been beheaded or stabbed through their chests. Bandits who had had a falling out with each other? No, their weapons were mostly clean. I crept cautiously forward, still listening, looking everywhere. I've always been good at observing the details. It's important for a man in my profession. One dead man caught my eye. He had a surprised expression on his face, blood on his blade, and a sword still stuck in his chest. Unlike the weapons carried by the bandits, which had hilts wrapped in leather cord, this sword had a metal handle with a round pommel at the bottom. I hesitated, then reached out and pulled the sword out. As soon as I touched the sword, my head rang. I could almost hear the distant sound of horns, the tramping of feet. My heart filled with courage, and for an instant I wasn't a fleecer of coin and a counter of cards. I was a soldier and leader of men. I tossed the sword away from me, breathing too hard. It lay in the moldering leaves. For a moment, a line of symbols glowed blue on the blade, but they faded quickly. A rune blade. Just what I didn't need, a magic sword pumping my head full of martial machismo and heroic notions. That's when I noticed the trail of blood heading off parallel to the road. So, the owner of the rune blade had killed the bandits, but taken a bad wound and limped off bleeding. I should leave this well enough alone. Maybe check the bodies for coin and then head for the nearest town. Whoever had done this was still out there. Any man who could kill half a dozen bandits would make quick work of me. The wind brought a low moan to my ears. It could be a trick designed to lure me into a trap. I made my living taking gold from the foolish and stayed alive mostly by being smart enough not to be around for bad things, like bandit ambushes. Another moan. I looked at the sword, lying there challenging me. I could still feel it urging me to noble deeds. I'm a coward and a liar, I told it, my words not half as cold as the wind that chapped my face. I'm not a hero. It didn't say anything, of course. It was a sword, and swords don't talk. I sighed, bent down, and picked up the sword, bracing myself against another flood of martial feeling, but the sword seemed muted. Maybe it understood I was already doing what it wanted. I started off along the trail, cursing myself. All I was going to do was get myself killed. It was damned cold, and I had no business trying to help anyone. I rounded a cedar wider than my shoulders, and there he was, lying propped up against the trunk. The middle-aged man stared up at me, gasping for breath. His hand pressed against his side. Dark blood oozed past his fingers. He glared at me. You're going to finish me with my own sword, he spat. That's my cloak you're wearing, you vulture. I was just passing by. I crouched down, far enough to leap back if he grabbed for the sword. Can I, do anything for that? I asked, nodding toward his wound. No good. He winced. I've killed enough men to know I'm done for. His breath came out in short gasps, making him stutter. The snow had stopped, but I felt colder than ever. The dying man's cloak on my shoulder was uncomfortably heavy. His eyes lit up with fierce resolve. He lunged forward suddenly, and I apparently wasn't as safe as I'd thought, because before I could move, he grabbed my tunic with both his hands. I pulled back, but his grasp was strong, even as he left bloody fingerprints on my collar. You're a traveler? Not with them? I must not have had my trustworthy face on. A smile would be the wrong expression, so I set my face to look, I hoped, appropriately solemn. I can be trusted, I said. All my life, I've been good at getting people to trust me. It was more than just my open face and easy manner. Oh, I had to work hard at it, listening to their worries and saying the words they wanted to hear. It wasn't till I had been living on my wits for almost a year that I met a hedge witch who told me I had more than just a silver tongue. It's magic, just like what I do, she'd told me. Keep quiet about it, have the sense not to do it in front of priests, and you'll be fine. What's your name? The dying man asked. Edward, I said at once. No hesitation. I never lied about my name. I'd lie about where I was from and who my father was or how I made my living, especially how I made my living, but not my name. Somehow, when I did, none of the rest of my fibs held up. The man was clearly sizing me up, so I returned the favor. He was old, well past 50. His palms showed the calluses from wielding a sword. His nose had been broken, probably years ago, and a scar split one white eyebrow. The lines on his face spoke of days spent out in sun and rain and nights of watchfulness. Soldier. Mercenary, most likely. He wore no lord's device on his clothing. My hand went to the golden arrow clasp at my throat. Not an arrow, I realized now. Empty spear, I said. Yes, he said. You know us? Heard of you, I said. Anyone who spent as much time in taverns as I did knew of the empty spear. The mercenary band recruited condemned men and offered them a chance at life, or took men who already had nothing to lose, to spend it depending on your perspective. They were like something out of a fairy tale, the way they swept in and out of other people's stories. The dying man stared up at me. His chest rose and fell a few times. At last he said, What sort of man are you, Edward? His words rocked me, and I had a wild urge to explain myself to him. At the same time, I felt a push from the sword, saw myself as taller and stronger than I really was, someone who could be depended on. I caught myself before saying anything. My mind raced. The mercenary studied me with a practiced eye, only a quick flicker of his eyes toward the sword betraying his interest there. He was trying to size me up. Now, what did he want to see? A man who could be trusted. He had something he wanted to finish, and he was dying. If there was any chance of gold in it, I was interested. So I needed to be a good man, a trustworthy man. That was a role I knew well. Usually I played it with a heavy dash of naivete blended in. Plenty of folk leap at a chance to take advantage of a dull-witted, honest man. In this case, though, I widened my eyes and injected as much surprise into my voice as I thought I could get away with. What sort? Well, I don't know that I've ever thought much about it. I glanced to the side. I do what I have to do, but I try not to hurt anyone else. The sword did not approve of my prevaricating. I felt its annoyance like a sting on my palm. Not needing the distraction, I let it drop to the moldering leaves beside me. You keep your word? The empty spear soldier asked. Again, his words seemed to demand a reply, and I resisted answering. He leaned forward again and grabbed my wrist. I resisted at first, then let him pull me closer. Yes, sir, I said. Can't say I always live up to it, but I try. I decided to try pushing my luck just a bit. The dying man was worried about something of value to him. Maybe there was more than just a purse of gold at stake. I let my mind fill in the mask I was trying to wear. A simple traveler, stopping to help a wounded man, concerned for his well-being, trustworthy. Oh, so trustworthy. Sir, I said, surely there's someone I can send word to. He coughed, bending over double. Flecks of blood spattered his hand. I helped him lean back against the tree. My horse ran off. She's a roan with a white face. She'll be around. He let out a hissing breath, his face twisting with pain. I sensed the ambush, stashed my saddlebags back at the road. Just before the crossroad, there's a dead tree with a lightning scar on one side. There's a cleft in the tree partway up that's hard to see unless you're mounted. That's where I hid them. Take them. Deliver the first parcel in the next town. His grip tightened on my wrist. His voice shot through me, making the hairs on my arms tingle. I understand, I said. He set his hand on my shoulder. You'll do it? Your word? His fingers dug into my shoulder, passing his urgency into me. How could he have such strength left in him? He was using almost his last breath to try to finish his task. On the sword, he said. Part of me wanted to leap up and pledge myself body and soul to anything he asked. I was surprised at how strong the urge was. Most of me, the part that kept me alive, resisted. I had run the same sort of hustle many times, and it never went well for the poor sap on the other end of things. I brought the sword hilt around and set it in the dying man's hand, covering them with my own. I'll do what I can, I said, licking my lips. There was a brief surge of feeling from the sword, like regret mingled with resolve. He glared up at me through those pale blue eyes as if trying to judge my soul. Then his expression softened and he fell back. His eyes clouded as though he were seeing all the things he left unfinished. That'll have to do, he said. Tell Lord Empty Spear. He coughed. Tell Einar I did my duty. He didn't speak again. I waited until he was dead and then a little longer, until my feet went numb and my need for a warm meal reasserted itself. The ground here was frozen. I couldn't have buried him if I wanted to. I strapped on his sword and went to find the horse. I got to the crossroads a little before dusk and found the bags where he'd said. I wanted to open them and see what was inside, but darkness was falling. The cold wind bit deeper, and I worried that there were more bandits about. I nudged the horse along the road, and we made good time. Riding made a nice change from walking. I'd rarely had the money to feed and stable a horse, but there'd been times, especially in taking my leave of a town where I'd overstayed my welcome, that I'd wished for one. My new cape kept me warmer than I'd been for weeks, but my feet ached with the cold. I kept one bare hand tucked beneath my cape at all times, switching them out whenever the other grew too numb to hold the reins. Maybe I'd be able to buy a pair of gloves in town. I'd left the last place in a bit more abruptly than planned, sneaking out just ahead of a pair of angry creditors, hence my lack. The warm cloak over my shoulders, heavy sword at my belt, and good horse between my legs said that I hadn't dreamed the whole thing. I am a deceiver by trade. My meals bought with gold I earned tricking fools out of their more honest wages, and I'd never have tried spinning such a tale. I certainly would never have dared invoke the name of the Empty Spear. The mercenaries were as much legend as truth. Let me tell you about the time with the Empty Spear was a sure sign whatever followed would be empty boasting. I'd spent 3 months within a mercenary company myself when I was very young and foolish. Nothing as illustrious as the Empty Spear, and I'd known it was a mistake after my first battle, when I'd gotten knocked out a whole 5 minutes into the fight, come to in the middle of the night, and run off as soon as I'd filled my pockets with battlefield loot. So, while I liked the way the sword sat on my hip, I tried to avoid actually touching it. I had no wish to fill my head with martial notions. I reached the village before full dark. Chimney smoke rose over the log palisade, bearing the scent of roasting chicken and warm bread to me. I inhaled, and my stomach gurgled in appreciation. As I rode in, two men stepped out from beside the gate. "Who are you?" one challenged. They thrust spears out to block my path. "A simple traveler," I said. They eyed me up and down, taking in my threadbare clothes and the fine cape. "Nobody travels these roads in the winter but scoundrels and tax collectors." "I assure you I am neither," I lied, trying not to shiver. "I merely want a hot meal and somewhere to sleep out of the wind." I thought about mentioning the bandits, but decided that would only invite questions. One of the guards' eyes narrowed as he studied me. They weren't going to let me in. I tried to gather my usual convincing ways about me, but it was almost like I'd used up all my luck earlier with the empty spear man. I needed to start fresh with them. "I'm here to deliver a message," I said. "To who?" they asked. Their hands tightened on their spears and my mouth got dry. If I didn't win them over fast, I'd find myself sleeping in a ditch for sure. I dismounted and opened the saddlebags, sticking my hand into one and feeling around. Immediately, I realized I'd made a mistake. My fingers touched small leather bags that gave a very distinctive tink when I touched them. Bags of coin. I didn't want the guards to see those. I rooted around and found a parcel of letters. I drew them out and squinted at the name. Survivors of John, Ian the miller's son. "Our miller's name is Adam," the guard told me. I flipped to the next letter. "Widow Tabitha?" They shook their heads. "I hope you're not trying to put something over on us," they said. I was, but like the best of lies, it was built on truth. As long as the empty spare man had meant this village when he'd told me to deliver the first message. I looked at the next letter. "To the mother of Adric Redbeard," I said. One of the guards held up a hand. "Hold," he said. "Adric Redbeard?" "That's right," I said. I tamped down the spark of excitement and pushed my luck. "You know her?" "She's a good woman," the guard said. "What sort of business you got with her?" I raised my chin and met his eyes, letting him see that I had nothing to hide, but nothing to share either. "My business is between her and the empty spear," I said grandly. My voice fell into tones of command without even trying. I don't usually play an officer, but it was just another role for me. "If you take me to her, I would be most grateful." The second guard still looked doubtful, but the one I'd been concentrating on nodded. He put his spear back against his shoulder. "Come inside. Adric's mother is cook at the pub." The guardsman closed up the gate behind me as heavy flakes of snow started to fall from the dark sky. At their order, I left the horse under an underhang of the palisade, but I took the saddlebags and slung them over my shoulder. The one who knew Adric's mother grabbed a torch off the wall, spoke to his friend briefly, then started off toward the center of the small town. "I had to promise to bring him a bowl of something hot," he said. "Hope you're good for it."
This is a delightful character.
This was one of my 6 Writers of the Future finalists, which I was very happy to finally have find a home. The title, "To Lie with Honor," is a bit of a pun, as will unfold shortly.
Oh, this is almost the epitome of scoundrel.
Mm-hmm.
That he's got nothing planned other than his fate, his future, his fortune, his next meal, and he's caught in the middle of something bigger.
Yes, he is a very fun character. One day I hope to write a novel or 3 about him.
Nice. So you mentioned it was one of your 6 finalists. You've had 6?
I had 6 before finally winning Writers of the Future. Yes, I believe, I'm not sure if I'm still the record holder, but I did beat out Scott Parkin, who was the previous record holder.
Wow. That is persistence. I
Mm-hmm.
applaud you. I understand, because if you're hitting at that level, you've got reasons to persist. But boy,
Yes.
that's persistence.
It also helps that I'm not a natural short story writer, so I wasn't quickly proing out.
Ah,
Mostly concentrate on novels. So for a long time, I was mostly writing short stories specifically for Writers of the Future rather than other magazine markets. I tend to write long So
No, can't imagine that. So is this, would you say this is your preferred genre, the gritty fantasy?
I love epic heroic fantasy. I have recently started writing in the lit RPG progression fantasy genres, which are being a ton of fun. And they're actually closer to heroic fantasy than you'd think. Lit RPG has a lot of numbers and stats and stuff in it, but it's got the same impulses of readers want a lot of action. They want something where we're jumping into the world right away. And they actually are quite hungry for world building and depth. They just don't know it. And progression fantasy is even more so. The nice thing about those is that the readers for lit RPG and progression fantasy tend to be new readers. They tend to be people whose previous experiences with storytelling are more in the video game genre. So everything is new to them, and they're excited and they're willing to take a chance on a new author starting a 10-book series, as opposed to epic fantasy, where we have a slight problem of a lot of readers want to read a completed series or nothing at all. And even with the advantages these days of self-publishing, where you can put out a complete series in perhaps 2 or 3 years, that's still very hard to get a career off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, my first love and true love is epic slash heroic fantasy.
Okay. Now, I think it's only fair that we bring up and mention to the readers that you're actually a partnership.
I am. My husband and I co-write together, and we currently have two pen names that we share equally. You'd think we'd give one of us each pen name. This story was written under the KD Julicher pen name, which is closer to our actual name. And then for the lit RPG, progression fantasy, military fantasy stuff we've been doing as serials, we're using the pen name of M. Talon, which is a Louis L'Amour reference. Partially because while the seems like the progression fantasy readers will read epic fantasy, that's not necessarily true the other way, and we're trying to keep the brands somewhat distinct, partially because we weren't sure how it was going to go and whether we wanted to have a direct connection back to our personal name with something. It's turned out to go really well, and I'm not worried about that anymore. But yes, we share two pen names. Currently, we are actively doing 3 web serials, one of which I am primary writer. No, 2 I'm primary writer on, one he's primary writer on. We both will go dictate our chapters, clean them up, send them to each other for heavy edits, or hey, this isn't working. Um, Take them, do our next round of edits, put them up, and then we frequently swap chapters. I dictated a chapter for his book yesterday that he wanted because he wanted a particular, more feminine viewpoint. And he's writing a short novella for my lit RPG space opera series to give me some time to get our progression fantasy off the ground. So we are completely collaborative, and it's something that it's a little hard to explain to a lot of other writers, even ones who do collaborate, because most other collaborators I've talked to talk about the importance of understanding, well, this is your job, this is their job, who has the final say. But for us, it's much more fluid. That's much more of, oh, hey, I need you to write this thing. I'm going to go write that thing. No, this doesn't work. And we have not necessarily complete veto power over each other's stuff, but a lot more say than most collaborators, I think.
Now, did this come before the marriage or did it evolve out of the marriage?
It definitely evolved out of the marriage. I've always been a writer, always been into it. There were a lot of years I only did NaNoWriMo. We started doing NaNoWriMo kind of together. We'd both do NaNoWriMo projects early on in our marriage, but it wasn't until about 5 years in that we started really seriously collaborating. And then it was much more, I was writing, he was editing. Sometimes he'd fix combat scenes for me because my combat wasn't very good at first. He'd fix male point of view things for me because that wasn't very good at first. And then it's just continued to evolve over the course of our 18-year marriage. How we do the partnership has changed a little bit here and there. We're even more dynamic these days than we ever were. But no, it's definitely came out of the marriage, rather than being good writing partners first.
Okay. I got to tell you, this fascinates me because I have a bit of an ego. I am not sure if I could collaborate with somebody or not. I have yet to have it tested, but I'm fascinated by people who can pull it off. I mean, Mike Resnick used to do it, but it was very much like you say. He was the senior writer. The secret behind it wasn't that hard. He didn't hide it. He would get invitations to anthologies where he didn't know some key element of the story, and he would go through his list of writer children, finding ones who had some knowledge of that, and saying, "Hey, can you do something on this?" And they would send a draft, and he would clean it up.
Right.
It's a very traditional model. He asked me to do an Aliens or Predator story because Mike never watched movies because Carol wouldn't let him, because he'd spend the whole time critiquing the story. So he was looking for somebody who knew Alien or Predator for an anthology. It's like, Mike, I'm honored. I have seen 3 Alien films and 2 Predator films, and I kind of didn't like the second Predator film. And I do not know deep lore. And he said, "Okay, you're honest." And he moved on to somebody who knew deep lore, and Marina gave him a wonderful draft that he cleaned up. So that's one model. Yours actually is kind of reminiscent of Niven and Purnell.
It's something, it's a little closer to that. We definitely, I think possibly closer to what Steve Miller and Sharon Lee had, from what I've heard, the Lee Aiden authors, who
Mm-hmm.
again were a long time romantic couple. Um, it definitely, I don't know that I recommend it for people to do with their spouse or partner. It's led to some pretty spectacular arguments over the years, but we now have a very good working relationship on how to do it. And it certainly helps prevent some other kinds of arguments like, why are you spending all of the vacation money and budget going to conventions? Or why are you spending all day Saturday afternoon editing something? Because we both have strong buy-in on this is important to us both. Um, and it works for us. I don't know. I think if I were going to try to collaborate with anyone else, it would be a very different situation. I would have to do a more like a Mike Resnick model. And it's funny you mentioned that about the movies, because that's just how we are watching movies. I constantly have to tell my kids, okay, when you watch movies with other people, they're not going to constantly be pausing it and going, aha, that was a painful decision. Sorry about that, kids.
Well, Mike would watch sports because there's no plot.
Yeah.
It's all just execution.
Yep.
But he said the last TV show worth watching was Maverick back in the 50s.
Well, I have certainly enjoyed watching Maverick. And I'm curmudgeonly enough to go, there aren't a whole lot more recent that I thought were worth watching.
You know, and he was constantly analyzing plots like he would as an editor,
Mhm.
and not many films and TV shows stand up to that level of editing because they're so
Oh,
constrained by the format.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's unfortunate. And then, oh, and I should also mention that our eldest daughter has now submitted to Writers of the Future twice. She's 15, so it'll be a while before she gets much farther than submitting, but, raising up generations of storytellers.
And I am excited by that for your sake and for her sake. I know that we have this tendency in the culture to look on nepotism and frown, but there's different kinds of nepotism.
Mhm.
She is much like Todd McCaffrey, who,
Yes.
when Todd was growing up, was reading and editing his mom's work and was hanging out when Uncle Isaac comes to dinner. So what this gives you, it's the same thing as Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore grew up in a family of Barrymore actors going back, I think, 5 generations. When you grow up in that family, you have an understanding of how the business works. That
Yes.
somebody coming in from outside has no idea that these things are out there, has no idea about how to submit to markets or anything. So your daughter starts out with a higher base level. She still has to do all the work,
Mhm.
but she knows how this is done because she's watched it.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm giving her critiques, but I'm not changing any of the words for her. Asking her the questions and letting her go do it on her own. So whenever she starts achieving success, it'll be her doing. I'm just there to cheerlead and to say that wasn't a very reasonable response from this character, was it?
Well, tell her that I am excited for her and I'm expecting big things. I'm expecting to see her up on that stage someday.
She
Not to
was
put
excited.
pressure on.
She was excited to hear I was coming on this podcast. She was like, "Oh, Martin Shoemaker, the guy who wrote the UML story models book." Like, yeah, and she likes that book a lot.
So, all right, we are at our 30-minute mark. So
All
we are
right,
ready now to turn over to the instant story part of the show, where you're
excellent.
going to give me a prompt and I am going to dictate a story from it, comma, including punctuation, exclamation point. And this will annoy some of the audience quite a bit, comma, I know, comma, but it's a habit I can't break when I'm dictating, period. I use Dragon Naturally Speaking, comma, and it puts in punctuation without me saying it, comma, but it doesn't guess nearly as well as it does if I tell it, period. So my apologies for the annoyance, comma, but this is what I do, dot, dot, dot. Sometimes not even talking to Dragon, comma, sometimes talking to machines or people, period.
I can live with that, but I'm going to say when there's a good Windows Whisper implementation, look at it because it's way better than Dragon and I don't have to punctuate my dictation. And I think that's the reason why my words per hour dictated are higher than yours.
We need to talk about this offline because it's not the topic here, but I've been
Yep.
doing some tests and there are some conditions where Whisper is an abominable failure.
I'd
Like,
love to talk about that offline.
yeah, like only 40% of the words that Dragon picks up.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
we're doing some testing on this to understand these
yeah.
different engines.
Yeah, talk to me because I'm very interested.
Yeah. We'll have time after recording tonight.
All right.
Well, I don't know. You're a busy mom with busy writing. Maybe you won't.
I got time.
All right.
I might have to bring my husband in to have a part of that conversation because he's into the dictating too. But all right, I am ready to shoot you a prompt if you are ready to receive it.
Yep.
This one comes from my personal background. You are QA for runic magic.
QA for runic magic. And I'm going to make notes here so that I do things like actually remember character names and such. If I don't, it all gets cleaned up. You understand how this works. It gets cleaned up in editing.
Oh, yeah. You wouldn't believe how many characters with exotic names are actually called Mike and Bob in my draft.
And I say I'm going to do that, and now my keyboard is not responding. There it is. Okay. QA for runic magic. Helen Jones looked at the carving before her, comma, and she shook her head, period. What was this guy thinking? Question mark. New line. She flipped over the tablet, comma, and that's when she understood. It was Greg, period. He was the sloppiest in the entire organization, period. He only cared about getting the picture onto the glyph, onto the tablet, period. He didn't ever check his work, period. New line. She carefully flipped the tablet back over, period. And that was when she smelled ... brimstone, question mark, or just ordinary sulfur dioxide, question mark, new line. Either way, comma, this was trouble, period. She backed away, comma, rifled through the closet, comma, and found her protective gloves, period. Donning them, comma, she wished she'd thought to wear them to begin with, period. But these ... these were a legacy from her mentor, comma, Karen Smalls, comma, and they only seem to work under certain conditions, period. And Helen had not been able to figure out what those were yet, period. She didn't know if they needed time to recharge, comma, or if they only worked under certain phases of the moon, period. She always suspected that if she used these too often, comma, they might fail her when she particularly needed them, period. New line. Like now, comma, she thought, comma, as she saw the smoke rising from the tablet, period. She quickly slid the gloves into place, comma, went back to the tablet, comma, picked it up, dash, dash, and it was getting hot, dash, dash, and took it to the oubliette, period. She opened the chamber door, comma, tossed the now glowing red tablet in, comma, and flushed, period. New line. One, dot, 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 two, dot, 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 three, dot, 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 sploosh! Exclamation point. The water spouted out, period. 3 seconds away from being caught in that, period. She sighed, comma, turned away, comma, and went back to make notes in her lab book, period. New line. That's when the voice said behind her, comma, that wasn't very nice, period. New line. She turned around, comma, instinctively grabbing the talisman around her neck, comma, and looked at the devil rising up from the bowl, comma, water dripping from his ears, his pointed ears and his long nose, comma, and his cloven hooves, period. New line. Jesus, dash, dash, new line. Exclamation point. Let's not be saying that, comma, or you're going to make me even angrier, period. I'm not him, comma, as you can obviously tell, period. And you're not supposed to use his name in vain, comma. Now are you? Question mark. Do you really want to open yourself up to me that easily? Question mark. New line. She shook her head, period. All right, comma, I will use another name in vain, period. Greg Stafford, exclamation point. How did he bind you to the tablet? Question mark. New line. The devil grinned, period. You would know that answer if you knew my name, period. New line. I would know your name if I analyzed the glyph, period. New line. That's too bad, period. You send it down to the septic tank, period. Would you like to go get it? Question mark. New line. New line. Helen shook her head, period. No, but somebody's going to, period. She touched the earring in her left ear, period. Greg Stafford to the QA lab immediately, period. Supervisor to the QA lab immediately, period. New line. You think you need 3 of you to deal with me? Question mark. New line. Helen laughed, period. I'm not going to deal with you, period. You're going to go back to the rune, comma, crawl back through it to where you came from, period. And you will leave me alone, period, new line. Or, question mark, new line. Or I shall publish this glyph, and it will get reproduced on every stone and spell book and archway and every bottle and book in the entire district, period. You will become so busy, comma, you will not get rest, period. He started to say something, comma, but she added, comma, and even you need rest, period. I've been around, period. I know better, period. New line. He chuckled, period. They can only work that with my true name, period. New line. And I can test the names very quickly through my laboratory and that glyph, period. New line. I could destroy it, dot, dot, dot. New line. No, you couldn't, dot, dot, dot. That's part of how the runic summoning works, period. You are powerless against the source of the rune, period. That's part of what binds you, period. If you hadn't been bound, dot, 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 if you'd ignored the call, dot, 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 if you could have ignored the call, dot, 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 then you would be able to break the tile to your heart's content. But the very fact that you came tells me that that is your kryptonite, period. New line. Kryptonite, question mark, new line. Good grief, dot, dot, dot. What do you read in those 9 hells of yours? Question mark, new line. Dot, dot, dot. I'm still into Dante, dot, dot, dot. And Ovid, dot, dot, dot. The classics, comma, you know, question mark, new line. Well, it's time you got some modern classics, period, new line. Do you have any recommendations, question mark, new line. Helen paused, period. This had to be a trick, comma, right? Question mark. This devil was asking her for book recommendations, question mark, new line. But then, comma, her trick brain played a big trick on her, period. She was very, very skilled at having a 2-track brain, period. One track solving and thinking while the other track interacted with the people around her, period. And one track had already started thinking of books that this devil might like, period. New line. And even as she thought it, comma, she said, comma, have you read Infernal, question mark, new line. What, question mark? I just told you that I read Dante, period, new line. No, comma, no, comma, no, dot, dot, dot. Inferno, period, by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell, period. The unauthorized sequel to Dante's Inferno, period, new line. How dare they? Exclamation point, new line. Dot, dot, dot. Copyright is death of the author plus 70 years, period. Dante's been gone a little longer than that, period, new line. So they stole his story, question mark? No, comma, they added to it, period, new line. I have to see that, dot, 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 new line. Oh, comma, then come to the alcove, period. I've got a small selection of books there, comma, that's in it, period, new line. Just as she was leading the devil to her office, comma, Greg and the supervisor appeared, period. It was Leonard comma, a very, very, very strict superior, comma, and Helen could tell that things were going to get weird from here, period. And that's right about the perfect time for a curveball.
All right, the curveball is the reason why Greg's runes are all weird and messed up is because he's been farming his workout on Upwork or a similar platform, and he's been getting a bunch of Indian magic scriptwriters to do it. And this demon is a Sanskrit demon, and their usual
Ow.
techniques are not going to work.
Ow. All right. So we have Leonard coming in as a supervisor, and we have a Sanskrit demon. But of course, she doesn't know that yet. Leonard frowned, comma, his large bushy eyebrows almost meeting in the middle, period. Miss Jones, comma, what is this? Question mark. New line. You'd have to ask Greg that, comma, she answered, period. Greg, ... new line. Greg was staring at the demon, comma, his eyes wide, period. What is ... who ... where ... new line. You tell me! Exclamation point. Helen said, comma, anger rising in her voice, period. You wrote the glyph that summoned him, period. You must know his name, period. New line. New line. Leonard turned and glared at Greg, period. Helen could see Greg shiver, period. It was not mere panic, period. Leonard's freezing gaze was not something anyone wanted to suffer from, period. Greg was visibly shivering, comma, goosebumps rising on his skin, period. Mr. Stafford, comma, have you discovered a technique for summoning creatures without their true names? Question mark. New line. Supervisor, comma, no, period. New line. Then how did you summon this? Question mark. New line. The demon looked up from his hardcover copy of Inferno by Niven and Purnell, comma, and laughed, period. He didn't, period. If he did, comma, I could smell it, period. New line. Leonard grit his teeth and seemed to be counting very quietly in ... Helen wasn't sure, period. Maybe it was some Native American language, period. That she wasn't skilled in those, period. But definitely a counting rhythm before he said, comma, Mr. Stafford, comma, who drew that rune? Question mark. New line. I would have to go check my computer, comma, supervisor, period. New line. What? Question mark. You drew it with your computer? Question mark. New line. No, comma, I ... I hired it out, period. New line. There was a loud crash from the office as the demon fell off the chair, comma, laughing, period. He hired it out? Question mark. That means none of you have any guess where I come from. Period. New line. Well, ... Greg said. Period. The email address was in Bangalore. Period. New line. Once more, Helen grabbed the token around her neck. Period. Bangalore? Question mark. This is a Hindu demon? Question mark. New line. But before she could say further, comma, the supervisor spoke into his earring. Period. Professor Ramamurthy, comma, to the QA lab, comma, now, period. And I mean now, period. He gestured at the floor with a strange twist of three fingers, comma, and Kartik Ramamurthy appeared in a puff of smoke, period. New line. Yes, comma, supervisor, dash, dash. The man stopped, comma, staring at the demon, period. New line. You recognize it, comma, I assume? Question mark, the supervisor asked, period. New line. I recognize the odor, period. That is a particular brimstone odor, comma, with heavy elements of ... of the Ganges, period. New line. Very good, comma, the demon said, period. Yes, comma, I am well familiar with all that is lost and found in the Ganges, period. You might say that it is part of my domain, period. New line. Kartik's eyes widened, period. You are ... fill in the blank? Question mark. And now we get to a little bit of technical expertise in how we do this dictation. I have no idea who fill in the blank is because I have very little expertise in Hindu demons and mythology, comma, but when we have this finally printed out, comma, I will have substituted an appropriate demon. Period. So you've just given me homework, period. New line. Kartik shook his head, period. Well, comma, I have good news, comma, and I have bad news, period. He is not very powerful in the pantheon, period. New line. Says you, comma, said the demon, period. Why, I ... new line. But Kartik continued, period. The bad news is knowing his name isn't going to help us get rid of him, period. This is going to take the proper ritual, comma, and it's going to take serious research to find out what we have to do, period. New line. And until then, comma, he's just going to hang around and smell up the place and annoy us, period. New line. Helen said, comma, so you have to go back to Bangalore and find a library of old rituals there? Question mark. New line. Kartik shook his head, comma, pulled up his cell phone, comma, punched a button, comma, and said, comma, hi, Mom! Exclamation point. New line. And that gets us to the 54-minute mark, which is a pretty good stopping point. And I think that is a great hook to stop on.
Absolutely. That's a lot of fun.
Okay. And I now have to do some homework on Indian demons and related. So this one's going to take me a while.
I'm sure it'll be easy. I know
yeah.
just enough about Hindu mythology to say that's a big rabbit hole you're about to fall down.
Yep. So but I only need a short story's worth of rabbit hole.
Yes.
So that was fun.
Very fun.
Because it's taking me out of my comfort zone, obviously.
Yes.
But I can do it. I've done it, just not anything that I've gotten published yet, which is really annoying. Um, Carrie insists that my Il Gran Cavallo, my story about Da Vinci's horse, she says that counts as fantasy, so I have published fantasy.
Yeah.
I kind of think of it as proto steampunk, but then you also say that steampunk is fantasy, and then all the steampunk fans get upset at me.
Yeah, well, steampunk is fantasy. They can't even figure out which side of the clothes to wear the underwear on. It's fantasy.
So, but that and your curveball, I just love that because that immediately took me off into a new direction, and being able to pull in Kartik and have the hi mom.
Yep.
Like, okay, this is every Indian programmer I've ever worked with.
Yep.
But it's the big family that has all the connections. So
Yeah, he's probably got a brother who's a, Brahmin or something.
when I taught at Microsoft's offices in Fargo, North Dakota, yes, Microsoft has offices in Fargo, or had at least then. I found one of the absolute best Indian restaurants I have ever been to because India trains a lot of really good programmers. Microsoft hires a lot of Indian programmers. And when Indian families come to your town, they have a strong family work ethic that nobody sits around. So they're looking for other things to do. And if you've got Indians who know the cuisine, what are they going to do? Make a restaurant that is seriously. I don't know that I would fly to Fargo just for the Indian food, but if I were flying through Fargo, I would stop there.
Well, I'll make sure if I'm ever, for some unknown reason, in Fargo, I'll get the tip from you, especially if they do a good tandoori chicken, because I haven't found a place around here that does.
But never do Fargo in the winter.
No, no.
I the only time I lost a student was in Fargo in January. Now, I only lost her. We didn't lose her permanently, but
Okay.
she left the office Tuesday after class, walked out to the parking lot to go to her car, and immediately slipped and fell and broke her leg because the parking lot was one giant sheet of ice. Like,
I did 2 winters in Iowa, and that was bad enough.
yep. So, all right. Where can people find you?
That is a great question. Right now, they can find me if anybody is interested in serial fiction. I'm writing on a site called Royal Road, which has a lot of serial fiction under the pen name of M. Talon. That's the letter M and then Talon. And I have 3 different active serials going. One is a space opera lit RPG called Not My First Space Rodeo about a Grunt who gets abducted along with his kid sister and his dying grandpa and forced to mine alien Bitcoin by shooting monsters in the face. That was my husband's series about a injured war vet who's killed by his own bulldozer and reincarnated in an alternate reality version of World War II Eastern Europe with giant mechs, magical girls, and he is a golem now. And then my brand new series, which is a tower climber progression fantasy, which I'm pitching as Cradle meets Brent Weeks Lightbringer. And so people who like those 2 series will know what that is. And that one's being a ton of fun, really pushing me out of my comfort zones. So that's where I am actively right now. The KD Julicher pen name is sort of on pause, not 100%. I do have some books on certain authors' desks that I'm waiting to hear back from, but so you need to not insert names here, are slow, and eventually we'll get back to you. But that's where they can find me right now.
All right, very cool.
I'm putting out, we're putting out what's 9 chapters a week right now between the 3 serials.
Ow.
The power of dictation.
Yep. So, all right. Well, that gives us right about to the end of our hour here. So I will thank people for tuning in. And I thank you for joining me. And we will let the audience go and then let's talk.
All right. Thank you for having me, Martin. It's been a lot of fun.
Yep.